Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of How Stories Work. Today, I'm going to talk about the atomic properties of a story beat. Now, it's likely I may change the name of this, but for right now, that's what I'm calling them, the atomic properties. And if you'd like to read more about them, you can always head over to Narrative First, and you go here, How to Classify the Atomic Elements of Story Structure. So I used to call them atomic elements. I'm now calling them atomic properties. So let's get into it. Here I have the story form for The Shawshank Redemption, just because it's one of the greatest movies of all time and because I know it really well. So if I come in here and I go to the main character through line, these are all the story beats that Subtxt said are a part of the story form. Based on what the story is about, that you can make your future when you abandon giving indirect assistance to people. So basically, when you stop towing the line, you can ensure that you have a better future. That's the premise. So when you plug that into Subtxt, you get all this information. And then when you go into each through line, so we're going to go into Red's through line, which is the Morgan Freeman character, you get all of these story beats. Now, a story beat isn't necessarily a scene. In the beginning of a story, it can be and usually is its own scene. But as you get down towards the end, they all start to weave tighter and tighter together to where you might have 4 or 5 different story beats from 2 or 3 different through lines, sometimes all 4 through lines in the same physical scene. So here in this first scene that we're going to look at, this is when he goes into the parole board, when he goes in there and walks in and they ask him if he's a changed man. Has everything gone well? And of course, he tells them exactly what he thinks they want to hear. But of course, they don't buy it because he's not really changed until the end of the story. Looking at the story form here, the first scene, the thematic conflict of the first scene is supposed to be all about knowledge. So that's the central thematic issue. That's the most important part of this story beat. So if you go from left to right, you'll see they go in order of importance. So knowledge is the most important part of it. And if you're not familiar with Dramatica or this seems alien to you, you can always find the easy definitions of everything right here. So if you pop open the help here, these are the beats that we'll be getting into. But if you drop down here into story beat details, you'll see knowledge, that which one holds to be true. So the problems in this scene are going to be about Red trying to get across what he holds to be true, which is if I just tell them what they want to hear, they're going to let me out, which obviously is not the correct way to go about doing things. Then as you go left to right, you have them in order of importance. So the first one is what I'm calling now the modality of the story beat. So you want to see knowledge in terms of a situation. And there are 4 modalities. You can see them here in the beats: situation, activity, mentality, and standpoint. And these are the 4 different ways that our minds classify conflict. We either see conflict as a fixed situation, where it's something about our place in the universe that is stuck and we have to get unstuck. We see conflict as activity, which is punching, kicking, fighting. We see conflict in terms of mentality, which is when we try to convince people or manipulate them through a way of thinking. And then finally, the last way we classify conflict is through a standpoint or a fixed attitude or some sort of stance. A complete scene goes through all 4 of these. You run into trouble when you have a scene that has all 4 activities, or every single part of a scene is a situation, or it's just people talking to each other, mentalities. What the mind expects and what the mind appreciates is when you go through all 4. So in this first scene, knowledge is going to be seen in a situation. So this would be what he knows in terms of his incarceration. So that feels great. Then the column to the right is the spatial aspect of the story beat. So this is going to get a little in depth here. And honestly speaking, I typically just focus on these first 2. I don't really look at the other 2 except in terms of theoretically how interesting it is. And perhaps down the road, I will figure out ways to leverage these. But for right now, I just focus on these first 2. So you're not going to miss anything if you leave out these next 2, especially the last column. So here, what does it mean, the spatial aspect of a story beat? If I look here, we can see potential, resistance, current, and power. And if you think about it, it's basically a dramatic circuit. This is an electric circuit. You have the potential here, which is wrapped up in proven. You have resistance here, wrapped up in result. The current flows like process. And then the power of the circuit is presumption. So that is how they relate to each other in terms of their spatial potential, as far as how each part of that scene works with one another. And then this last column is the temporal aspect of the story beat, which in a story like The Shawshank Redemption, I really wouldn't get too much into it. Point of fact, these are all really just growth, even though they have different versions of what that means. Growth, expansion, transformation, and transcendence. You have stuff that's growing, so temporarily it's growing. Then it expands, so it reaches out. Then there's some sort of transformation in the growth, and then a transcendence, which is that lifting up part, the spiral double helix of DNA moving up into the next story beat. Usually you just do that intuitively anyways. The problem that most people run into is they end on this last one and think that this is the ending of the scene and cut off the dramatic potential, when really what you want to do is make sure it gets set up as a power. There's power for the next story beat so that it's always flowing through everything. Really quickly here, so this is that first scene when Red goes through it. And in the first beat, it's proven, and it's supposed to show up as a situation, and it will relate some potential for growth. So if I come down here into the individual story beats here for the scene, Red comes into the scene knowing that the same thing is going to happen. He's going to say what they want to hear, and he's going to be denied. So that's what he knows. So that's his issue. The review board is motivated to prove that he is ready to be released. So here we have proven. He's doing what's been done before, which is an illustration of proven, what that actually means. You open this up. It's a rating of knowledge based on corroboration. So that works. And then it's going to show up as a situation with a potential for growth. During the process, Red examines the aftermath of his time spent at Shawshank already, but it doesn't look like he is showing what they're looking for. So he's trying to give them the results in examining the aftermath of all his work there. So results is being shown as an activity. So he's dispensing the information, and it's an activity that's creating resistance because they can see this is not happening. In expansion, it's almost like negative expansion. It's not opening up his options for leaving. Then that moves into process as a mentality. And process here is the mechanism through which a cause leads to an effect. So it's basically just the processing of it. Red tries to tell them what they want to hear, but it gets him nowhere. The board wonders if Red feels as if he has been changed by the process. Usually the mentality beat is where the conversations, the manipulations, trying to convince somebody of something. Process here, he's hating their process. And did our process work, is shown up as a mentality from both angles here, and it's creating current, it's creating conflict, and is moving the scene in a transformative manner to where it ends up in presumption. Knowing Red is not ready to leave, the board rejects Red and label him as suspect when it comes to being fully rehabilitated. Presumption is essentially the opposite of proven, which is a rating of knowledge that has not been tested. So proven is something that's been corroborated. The other one is one that has not been tested. And that's the magic of writing a scene like this. When you want to talk about how a scene turns, the beginning of the scene and the end of the scene, they're essentially dramatic opposites. Proven and presumption work really well against each other because they are designed to be dynamically opposed. Here, presumption ends up as a standpoint. So not only Red's bad attitude, but their stance on whether or not he's ready for release. And that creates power. So not only does it create power for the board to deny him in the next time around, but it also creates even more power for Red to go into the next scene and to set up the potential for his eventual transcendence out of Shawshank. So that's a really quick look at the atomic properties of story beats and how you can leverage these to write complete and compelling scenes. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and I will see you tomorrow.